Professor V. Eugene Barito, Pro-Vice Chancellor and Principal of the Caveville Campus, UWI. Professor Justin Robinson, our Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences. Professor Emeritus Andrew Downs, former PVC Planning. Our featured speaker, Dr. James Fletcher, former Minister for the Public Service, Information, Broadcasting, Sustainable Development, Energy, Science and Technology, and all the rest of the acreage that comes with that in the government of St. Lucia. Mrs. June Emmanuel, wife of the late Dr. Patrick Emmanuel. Dr. Maisha Emmanuel, niece of Dr. Emmanuel and other members of the Emmanuel family. Present and former UWI colleagues. Head of Department of Government, Sociology, Social Work, and Psychology, members of the department, other members of the university community, our friends from law, our friends from SERMIS, our friends from Salises, our friends from Pure and Applied. I'm saying all of those names because normally our Pat Emmanuel Memorial Lecture attracts a more narrow community, but tonight we have a wider cross-section of the university community to welcome. Members of the Grenada Association of Barbados, members of the St. Lucia Association of Barbados, and of course our very special students, members of the student body. There are some discussions as to whether you are here for Dr. Grenade's special incentive, but I always say that you are here because of your deep interest in the topic that we have before us, and it is a topic that touches upon international relations, political science, climate change, environmental management, so we are all here for that. Members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, friends and comrades, all. Tonight is always a very, very happy night for the Department of Government, Sociology, and Social Work. Our annual Patrick Emmanuel Memorial Lecture is always a cause for joy and celebration. And tonight we are in our 14th year of hosting our lecture, and I think that deserves a round of applause. And to tell us some more and to give us her own remarks in her own voice, I will welcome to the podium Dr. Wendy Grenade. I'll be your chair for tonight's proceedings. My name is Tennyson Joseph. So our head of department, Dr. Wendy Grenade.
Thank you, Dr. Joseph. Professor V. Eugene Barito, Pro-Vice Chancellor and Principal, Caveville Campus. Professor Justin Robinson, Dean, Faculty of Social Sciences. Professor Emeritus Andrew Downs, former Pro-Vice Chancellor Planning. Our special guest, Dr. James Fletcher, former Minister for Public Service, Information, Broadcasting, Sustainable Development, Energy, and Science and Technology, the Government of St. Lucia. A special welcome. Mrs. June Emmanuel, wife of the late Dr. Patrick Emmanuel. Dr. Maisha Emmanuel, niece of Dr. Emmanuel and other members of the Emmanuel family. Present and former UE colleagues, members of the Department of Government and other colleagues within other faculties at the Caveville campus. Members of the Grenada Association of Barbados, members of the St. Lucia Association of Barbados, to our wonderful students, welcome. Members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, good evening to all of you. Welcome to the 14th Patrick A.M. Emmanuel Memorial Lecture. Greetings from the Department of Government, Sociology, social work, and psychology. Thank you all for being here with us this evening. On your behalf, we thank Mrs. June Emmanuel and the Emmanuel family for allowing us to continue to celebrate the life and work of the late Dr. Patrick Emmanuel through this memorial lecture series. Now, this is one of the flagship events of the department's annual calendar, and we thank you for being here. We continue to honor the work and memory of Dr. Patrick Emmanuel for several reasons. First, by honoring Pat's memory, we keep alive his ideas and introduce younger generations to his work. It is our hope that students would become curious about his contributions to Caribbean scholarship. We want to see some MPhil and PhD students theorizing about Pat Emmanuel. As head of department, I pledge a scholarship to any student who wishes to pursue an MPhil or PhD analyzing Pat Emmanuel's contribution to the Caribbean's intellectual tradition. I promise that. Those of you studying governance, elections, Caribbean integration, etc., there is a body of work from which you can gain intellectual nourishment. In giving the 10th lecture, Principal Barito reminded us that we have some unfinished business with Pat Emmanuel and Caribbean and political thought. Second, we continue to honor the late Pat Emmanuel to develop a reservoir of ideas to advance Caribbean scholarship and praxis. If you turn to the back of your program, you would see the titles of the previous esteemed speakers. Shortly, an edited volume would be in print, which would add immensely to our library collections here. We intend to market the book internationally as part of our UWI mandate to be regionally grounded while expanding our global reach. And I thank Dr. Joseph for leading in this regard. I thank all our previous speakers for giving to us what would be a most valuable tribute to the life and legacy of the late Pat Emmanuel. Finally, we continue to honor the work and memory of Pat Emmanuel to keep in focus the complexity of the Caribbean's reality and the need for rigorous analysis and concerted action. This is necessary to ensure that as Caribbean people, we stand tall in what others may consider to be our smallness. This is to ensure that we find ways to boldly confront the issues that bedevil us, such as the climate crisis. Dr. Fletcher, thank you for accepting our invitation to deliver this year's lecture. You have chosen a theme for such a time as this: business unusual in looking at the threat of climate change. For the child in Dominica who woke up to a new normal after Hurricane Maria, it is not business as usual. For that mother in the heart of Grand Bahama, or that elderly man in Barbuda or the BVI, it is not business as usual. For the farmer and fisherwoman who face uncertainty because their very livelihood strategies are threatened by climate change, it is not business as usual. New times demand new thinking and bold action. As Caribbean small island developing states, we have to ensure that the climate crisis gets the attention it deserves on the global threat agenda. In his address to the United Nations General Assembly after the passage of Hurricane Maria, Prime Minister Roosevelt Skerrit declared to the world that Hurricane Maria was a nuclear hurricane. He twinned nuclear and hurricane to draw the world's attention to the severity of the climate crisis. In her recent climate plea to the United Nations, Prime Minister Mia Motley lamented, and I quote, "Some of the most severe consequences of climate change can no longer be avoided." How many times have we been told this? How many times has science reinforced that there is a very threat to our survival, end of quote. The Barbadian leader asks of the world's leaders, do you not see what is happening? Do you not care? End of quote. Here at the Cave Hill campus of the University of the West Indies, we care. Dr. Fletcher, thank you for the role you played in leading the Caribbean's negotiations in the Paris Agreement, notwithstanding the fact that earlier this week, the US president pulled out of the agreement. Thank you also for donating to us a copy of your book, Governing in a Small Caribbean Island. I assure you that we would present it to the library as a resource for students. In the chapter on climate change, you indicated that, and I quote, the impacts of climate change will manifest in several forms: more frequent flooding, prolonged droughts, sea level rise, the acidification of oceans, and the impact on fisheries and marine ecosystems, the public health threats posed by new vector-borne diseases, to name a few, end of quote. In your book, you also called on Caribbean countries to seek opportunities and leverage their position as SIDS to mobilize important financial and technical resources for the diverse sectors that are impacted by climate change. You also called for advocacy and decisive and urgent action. Now, we understand that there is a collective vulnerability as we discuss the climate crisis. But what gives us hope is that as Caribbean people, we have a collective resilience, that instinct to overcome and bounce back. This gives us such hope when we are tempted to doubt. So thank you, Dr. Fletcher, again for accepting our invitation, and thank you for the topic you have chosen. Welcome again to all of you. May we have an intellectually stimulating evening. Thank you.
And thank you, Dr. Grenard, for your excellent introduction and welcome, and for having put our Pat Emmanuel lecture in such wonderful perspective, and for contextualizing our discussion tonight. I think you deserve a special round of applause for that, and welcome. And without any further delay, I call on our Dean, Professor Justin Robinson, to give remarks of his own.
Thanks, Chair. Professor Judy Barreto, PVC and Principal, Cave Hill Campus. Dr. Wendy Grenade, Head of Department. Dr. Fletcher, our guest speaker, special welcome. PVC Emeritus, I'm creating that title, Andrew Downs. Members of the Emmanuel family, ladies and gentlemen, special good evening. Again, it always gives me tremendous pleasure to give some brief remarks at what is one of the major events for the Faculty of Social Sciences as we celebrate an outstanding Caribbean scholar. And we are committed to doing this every year. We're in our 14th year. As I often say, I consider myself to be the quintessential Caribbean person. So I want you to note my accent very clearly here, because this is what the Caribbean accent sounds like. Because once I open my mouth in Barbados, people are aware that I am not Barbadian. When I go home to St. Vincent, they don't think I sound Vincentian. And I was recently at a CARICOM meeting, and no one could figure out exactly where I was from. So I've concluded that this is the Caribbean accent, so you want to pay attention to it. I remember when I was an undergraduate here that computers was something that a few people in SciTech really meddled with. We had a limited exposure to computers in one of our accounting courses where you did a little something and you really thought it was cutting-edge technology. Now computers are sort of central to everything we do. And I sense that the climate change issue is of a similar ilk. It's really no longer something that Surmies and a few techies and persons know anything about. Is now a central issue to our lives. And I think as a faculty, one of our challenges will be to infuse that knowledge and awareness of the climate change, and its possible effects into all aspects of our curriculum. Because it's easy to speak about awareness of climate change, but it's quite a different issue to understand the fundamental redefining of things like economic development if we are to live in a sustainable manner. And without mounting a criticism, I can still remember when economic prosperity in Barbados was defined as a car in every household. And I think it's still true that many Barbadians might still think of economic success as a car in every house. So it's probably gone beyond that, where it's a car for every adult member of the household. But if we are to address the climate crisis, then key aspects of our lifestyle that we take for granted are actually going to have to change. Because what are some of the major drivers of climate change? Certainly fossil fuels with our cars, those steaks and the meat that everyone loves to eat. So understanding the climate change, the climate crisis, and what it means for our lifestyles and how we define things like economic development are going to be quite critical if we are to have sustainable lifestyles in the Caribbean. I mean, I have a visual in my mind of climate change. When I was a PhD student in Manchester, we took a trip to the Maldives, and we stayed at a resort. And one of my colleagues who went on that trip, who is now back in India, sort of sent me a WhatsApp picture, and that resort no longer exists. You know, the resort we went to is essentially just, it's just not there. It's just water, and that's a clear visual, because the Maldives, again, is one of the countries that is on the front line of that climate crisis. So I view this lecture as really a critical first step as the Faculty of Social Sciences begins to pivot its curriculum to infuse an awareness of the climate crisis, climate change, and sustainable lifestyles in all aspects of our curriculum. Because without a sustainable planet, all the things we learn in economics and management, etc., are really all pointless. So I welcome this topic, as we as a faculty, the largest faculty which touches the most students, because I don't think we're going to have a lot of impact unless the people who do accounting, economics, and management, unless they become aware of this and take it into their practice in their organizations. I think we're going to have a lot of activists raising an issue, but our key decision makers are not going to be fully appreciative of those issues. So again, I warmly welcome you, and I look forward to tonight's lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Robinson. And let me just tell you that I think our friends in social work have already begun to infuse the question of resilience and climate change in some of the teaching and some of the actual courses. And Deborah is here, and she can attest to that. Let me recognize Professor Rosina Wiltshire. I apologize for not having acknowledged you in my first round of introductions. The students, I always make a point about telling the students who Professor Rosina Wiltshire is, because one of the sad things I face as a lecturer in political science is that they all come to me saying that they are students of international relations. So international relations is elevated above political science. Well, Professor Rosina Wiltshire is one of the founders of that discipline at the Mona campus, one of the earliest pioneers of international relations. And she is a former head resident rep of the UNDP in Barbados. So you all are in the company of giants. So make it your duty to say something to her afterwards, and you can tell your grandchildren about it in a few years. We have a brief musical interlude. Our musician is here. I think he's been with us for over 10 years, and I think our economist should say something on his behalf in relation to inflation and the cost, the amount of money we pay him for having done that, and we thank him for his commitment to us. He's here with us every year, and he gets better and better every year, if we can say so. So we look forward to his brief interlude. Former student in our department, graduating sociology, and a teacher of music at the Lester Vaughan Secondary School. So I think we now come to the reason why we're all here. and it's my duty to introduce our guest speaker, our invited guest, Dr. Jimmy Fletcher, or Jimmy as he prefers to be called. I'm privileged to introduce him as a friend and as someone with whom I've had some professional and political association, and also as someone whose public service to St. Lucia and the Caribbean I've had the honor of observing from a very safe distance. Dr. Fletcher does not know this, but I first became aware of his existence in the late 1980s when I completed my A-levels and assumed the role of a teacher at a secondary school in St. Lucia, which happened to be the very secondary school where he had taught as a graduate teacher before departing in 1987 to do his studies for his PhD in crop physiology at the University of Cambridge, UK. At the time, Jimmy would be making his summer visits to old acquaintances at the school, and the more senior teachers would speak glowingly behind his back of this very, very bright boy doing his PhD at Cambridge, who was destined to make a very big impact on his country sometime in the future. Even from this distance, his reputation preceded him and was already serving as a source of inspiration to younger generations of citizens of whom he was largely unaware. My next and most direct association with Jimmy occurred when I returned to St. Lucia upon completion of my MPhil at Cave Hill, and he was at the time PhD graduate, Dr. James Fletcher, serving as president of the St. Lucia Guild of Graduates. It was a moment when, by a strange historical accident, we were both interested in using our learning to engage in programs of popular education and to raise the political consciousness of St. Lucians and to push back against public intolerance of all things intellectual. By all accounts, under his leadership and in association with a group of like-minded individuals, the Guild of Graduates was transformed from a petty bourgeois organization concerned with hosting monthly tea parties and games nights, a kind of graduate social club, into a committee of professional resource persons putting their knowledge at the disposal of the media and at the disposal of organized political groups willing to accept their advice. It can be safely said that the current culture in St. Lucia of wall-to-wall talk shows and the now taken for granted practice of young professionals giving their comments freely to the media was the direct result of the softening of the intellectual battlefield, which was achieved under his leadership of the Guild of Graduates. Perhaps the clearest proof that his leadership of the Guild had marked an important shift in public consciousness was the election of 1997, which ushered in a significant moment of political change when a slightly left of center, mildly progressive government, led by Kenny Anthony, was elected into office after roughly 4 decades of cumulative opposition. It was with the election of Kenny Anthony in 2007 that our guest speaker, Dr. James Fletcher, came more prominently to the national attention of his country. After the election, Jimmy's training as a biochemist and agricultural scientist and an all-round technocrat and policymaker was pressed into service when he was appointed as a permanent secretary in the Ministry of Agriculture between 1998 and 2003, and as cabinet secretary from 2003 to 2007. It was around this time, too, that my own professional association with Jimmy would deepen, as having completed my PhD in 2001, I served as the admin attaché to the Prime Minister, which brought us both under the same roof in the office of the Prime Minister when he was in his earliest years as cabinet secretary in 2003. It was a period of the most rapid modernization of the St. Lucian economy since the 1950s, as St. Lucia moved from being a largely agricultural monocrop economy to an economy built upon tourism and services. This is not known by many, but although he was officially permanent secretary and cabinet secretary, those titles did not stop him from literally dirtying his hands in the construction of St. Lucia's most internationally recognized project during this period, the Beausejour Cricket Ground, now the Darren Sammy Cricket Ground. In the earliest days of the Beausejour Cricket Ground, most observers were awestruck by the thickness and lush greenness of the outfield. I was close enough to the process to know that the greenness, lushness, and evenness of the grass was due to the fact that he was on permanent call to lend his expertise in crop physiology at the slightest hint of a problem with the outfield. I think Ernest Hiller used to call him every minute when there were bugs and there was brown in the grass. His contribution to the development of St. Lucia would move to new heights and would assume a regional and global dimension when, following the 2011 general election in St. Lucia, he was appointed between 2011 and 2016 as Minister for the Public Service, Information, Broadcasting, Sustainable Development, Energy, Science, and Technology. During his tenure as a government minister, he led St. Lucia on an aggressive path towards energy sector modernization. This involved a comprehensive program of energy legislation reform, the establishment of an independent multi-sector regulator, new investments in utility-scale renewable energy generation, a revival of the geothermal exploration in the south of the island, and the installation of rooftop solar photovoltaic units on government-owned buildings. He played a pivotal role in the thrust toward making information technology widely available across St. Lucia. He oversaw the establishment of state-of-the-art information technology centers in several underserved communities, and initiated the development of GINet, a comprehensive government information network that, among other things, provides free Wi-Fi service across the island. He is indeed a modernizer. We can say openly that it is his work as Minister of Energy that has justified his presence here today. It was in his capacity as Minister of Energy that he played a leading role in what has now become known as the Paris Climate Agreement, or the Paris Accord of 2015. As part of the Caribbean's work on and towards the Paris Agreement, Dr. Fletcher chaired the Caribbean's delegation for negotiations, and he quite significantly was selected by the President of the Conference of Parties as a member of the group of ministerial facilitators to negotiate agreement on the final text of the Paris Accord, a significant and singular achievement indeed. It may be true to say that Dr. Fletcher is indeed the highest profile living Caribbean person with expertise in the issues surrounding the global politics of climate change, both as a scientist and as a political leader and activist. In addition to his many academic awards as a student, Dr. Fletcher has received a number of significant regional and global awards for his professional work, included among which are the Outstanding Leadership Award from CARICAD and the Outstanding Leadership Award from the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries in St. Lucia in 2006. Perhaps his most significant award thus far was his recent selection by the Chevening Scholarship Program of the UK's Foreign and Commonwealth Office as one of its 35 global change makers, an award that was given to him as part of the commemoration of the 35th anniversary of the Chevening Program, a program which has provided scholarships to over 50,000 global leaders from over 160 countries, and he was among the top 35 most recognizable and most outstanding, and again for that, I think he deserves a round of applause. So Dr. Fletcher comes to us tonight well chosen, well decorated, and well prepared. But there is little doubt that it is this scary business of climate change which has brought him here to us tonight. Our cherished and avid followers of our Pat Emmanuel lecture series would no doubt have noted the fact that our invitation to Dr. Fletcher marks an important break in our tradition so far. Nearly all of our previous speakers have come to us as having served long careers in academia. Many have been political leaders, political scientists, or activists, and nearly all can be considered social scientists. Nearly all of our previous speakers have been persons who had some contact with Patrick Emmanuel, and tonight we are happy to have a natural scientist from the post-Emmanuel generation who has found himself drawn into domestic, regional, and global politics by accident rather than by choice. But we are also happy that we have not deviated from the mission of the Pat Emmanuel lecture series, as you heard from our head a few minutes ago. Our mission has always been to bring to a younger generation of Caribbean students a discussion on contemporary political issues by a leading Caribbean personality who shares Pat Emmanuel's passion for OECS and Caribbean politics. As a former director of the Social and Sustainable Development arm in the Secretariat of the OECS, and as the author of a book on governing in a small island state, Jimmy ticks off Pat's OECS box. In addition, we cannot think of a more pressing and urgent political issue than the question of climate change and the existential crisis which it poses to small islands of the Caribbean. We are certainly happy too that our choice of topic and speaker has allowed us to welcome students of environmental management studies, students of international relations and political science, students of sciences, and students of the pure sciences to our Pat Emmanuel lecture here tonight. And we certainly cannot think of a more qualified Caribbean personality who is able to speak to us on the topic for tonight's discussion, Business Unusual, the Caribbean's response to the existential threat of climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor and privilege to welcome to the podium Dr. Jimmy Fletcher.
Professor V. Eugene Barreto, Pro Vice Chancellor and Principal of the Cavell Campus of the University of the West Indies. Professor Justin Robinson, Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences. Professor Emeritus Andrew Downs, former PVC Planning. Professor Rosina Wiltshire. Mrs. June Emmanuel, wife of the late Dr. Patrick Emmanuel. Dr. Maisha Emmanuel, niece of Dr. Emmanuel and other members of the Emmanuel family. Faculty of the University of the Cavell Campus of the University of the West Indies, members of the Grenada Association of Barbados, members of the St. Lucia Association of Barbados. Dr. Grenade, head of the department, Dr. Joseph, Tennyson Joseph, my very good friend, and Tennyson, I really wish I could bottle or take that introduction everywhere that I go. Members of the student body, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen. It's good to know that Tennyson doesn't know everything about me, because Tennyson said that there was one box that I didn't tick off, and that was an association with the Emmanuel family, but he's actually very wrong. The wife of the late Pat Emmanuel, June Emmanuel, is a very close family friend. My wife, when she attended Cavell Campus, spent most of her days at the home of Pat and June Emmanuel. She refers to Pat as her movie buddy. I think she used to watch movies with Pat all the time. So to the point where June is not just known to me as June, she's known to me as Auntie June. The last time I came to Barbados and spent an extended period on holiday was to watch the finals of the 2007 ICC Cricket World Cup, and I stayed at June's home. So Tennyson, you're actually wrong on this one, that I am closely associated to the Emmanuel family. So there's another thing Tennyson didn't tell you in his very colorful description of me, and that is that I actually had to come to his defense once. One of the former presenters of this Pat Emmanuel Memorial Lecture, once in response to Tennyson Joseph, the audacious, outspoken commentator on political matters in St. Lucia that he was, no longer is, that he was, commented on the disposition of a particular prime minister and his apparent anti-intellectual approach, which was a little strange coming from an intellectual background himself. And that prime minister advised Tennyson Joseph, who at the time was lecturing at the Safa Lewis Community College, to, I think his exact words were, when we pay them to lecture and to lecture our young people, they must stay and lecture and not talk about political matters. And as the president of the guild, I had to come to Tennyson's defense and say that I expected much better of the person who was making those comments. So Tennyson didn't tell you that, but actually I had to defend him once. So tonight I've been asked to speak on the subject, or actually I chose to speak on the subject of the business unusual, the existential threat of climate change. So I think we should start off by really looking at the problem. We refer to climate change as an existential threat. Is it really an existential threat? How serious a problem is it? Well, first of all, we've all heard about greenhouse gas emissions. You know that there's this problem with greenhouse gas emissions, and greenhouse gas emissions are increasing. Well, that actually is the case. When you look at what has been happening with greenhouse gases from the 1900s, you'll see that greenhouse gases, and I'll speak a little bit. This is not going to be a technical lecture, so don't be worried. I'm not going to use my science background to bore you with scientific terms. This is nothing like that. One of the problems that technical people have is that they speak in scientific language and they lose people. People's eyes gloss over very, very quickly. So I'll try most definitely not to do that. But greenhouse gas emissions have been increasing from the 1900s, and particularly when heavy industrialization started in the 1950s, 1960s. And you don't have to be a math major for you to see what has been happening to that curve since 1950. And that's because we've really been producing too much of those greenhouse gases. And when you speak of greenhouse gases, what exactly are we speaking about? Well, we're speaking about carbon dioxide, which we get from the burning of fossil fuels for energy and also in our vehicles. We speak of carbon dioxide also that we get whenever there's deforestation or we till the soil, we cultivate the soil, because when we do that, we disturb the carbon dioxide that is being stored in plant material, and that's released back out into the atmosphere. We're also speaking about methane gas, and actually I saw a very interesting video recently, and it's amazing the people who now are joining the climate change justice bandwagon. And I saw Beanie Man talking to a group of students in Jamaica, and he was explaining to them about methane gas, and he was saying that methane gas, you get that from cows, and you have to stop eating cows, and his tagline was, cow poop no good. And it's true. I mean, you get methane from the material that's produced from livestock, and as more and more livestock is harvested, it produces methane gas. So Beanie Man is right, cow poop no good. You also have nitrous oxide that you get from fertilizers, and also you have some of the fluorocarbons that you get from refrigerated material. And basically the electricity and the electricity, generation of electricity, agriculture, those are the major producers of carbon dioxide and of greenhouse gases. And who are the major emitters? Well, China, the United States, the European Union, India, Russia, Japan. Those are the major emitters. And you'll see what has been happening with China's emissions of greenhouse gases. That's that red line there. From the time of the heavy industrialization of China, China has really surpassed everyone. And that's very important because politically, China belongs to a group called G77, G77 plus China. And when we negotiate in the international arena, that group of G77 plus China is also the group that small island developing states like the Caribbean belong to. And we are negotiating against the developed countries, so against the United States, the European Union, Australia, New Zealand, and calling on them to curb their emissions of greenhouse gases. And they very often say to us, but one of the members of your group, China, is the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases. But it's kind of difficult for us to disassociate ourselves from China, and also India. India is a member of G77 plus China, because they have a very heavy and strong political influence. But they do diminish our negotiating power in the climate change arena, and not just in the climate change arena, in very many other arenas, because there is not a similarity of development profile, there's not a similarity of need, there's not a similarity of purpose, but for some reason we continue with the construct of G77 plus China. Now, when we speak about a greenhouse gas effect, what are we speaking about? This is a classroom, so let me see a show of hands. How many of you has ever stood in a greenhouse in the middle of the day? Anybody? Let's see how many farmers or pseudo-farmers we have in this room. Yeah, Neil, I know you would. Okay, some of you. One of the things you'll notice about standing in the greenhouse in the middle of the day is that that greenhouse is extremely hot, much hotter than the outside. And why is that? Because the greenhouse has a covering, and that covering traps the heat, so it prevents the heat from escaping. So all of that heat is reflected back, and your greenhouse is much warmer than the ambient temperature outside. Well, greenhouse gases do the same thing. The more carbon dioxide and methane and nitrous oxide we produce, is the thicker this film above our planet becomes. And what that does is that it traps the heat that is generated on the planet, and it sends much of that heat back down. So instead of that heat being able to escape into outer space, that heat is being reflected back onto Earth. So that's why we call them greenhouse gases, because they have this type of greenhouse effect. Carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, they create a greenhouse around the planet, and the thicker that covering is the warmer our planet gets. And the evidence of that is very clear. If you look at global temperatures, since the 1880s, you'll see that global temperatures have been increasing very, very steadily. So when people tell you that, it's not getting warmer, science shows you don't really need a thermometer, you don't need to use anecdotal evidence. The science shows very, very clearly that our planet is getting warmer, and our planet is getting warmer at an alarming rate. And if you use 1880 as a benchmark, the 5 hottest years in the history of our planet have been the 5 last years in the history of our planet. 2016 was the hottest year. And that's significant because 2016 was a year when El Nino ended. And El Nino, one of the things El Nino does is that it warms up the Atlantic Ocean. So there's always a warming effect brought by El Nino. So it's not that unusual for 2016 to be warm, but 2016 was significantly warmer. But 2017, 2015, 2018, 2014, and if you were to take out 2010 in there that has snuck in, you would find that really the last 6 years have been 6 of the 7 hottest years in the history of our planet. And it really is not abating. June of this year was the hottest June ever in the history of our planet. Then July comes along, and July is not just the hottest July ever in the history of our planet, but July was the hottest month ever in the history of our planet. Not the hottest July, the hottest month ever. August not to be outdone, and then July you saw temperatures, record temperatures falling in the United Kingdom, in Paris, in the Netherlands, in Belgium. So in at least 5 countries, you had record temperatures. The maximum temperature ever was reached in July. Then August comes along, and August doesn't want to be outdone. So August was tied as the second hottest August ever for the globe. Then comes September, and September is tied as the hottest September ever on record for our planet. And then comes October. And October was the hottest October ever in the history of our planet. You starting to get the trend now? Right. And the planet is currently on track. Earth is currently on track for having its second warmest year ever. And there's no El Nino. So there's no El Nino effect that's warming the planet. This is just heat that is being generated. So it tells you that we really are in a serious place. But what does all of that mean? Yeah, okay, so it's getting warmer, so it means that maybe fewer people will come to the Caribbean from the United States and the UK because those countries will get warmer. Maybe, yeah, more of us will have to buy air-conditioned units. What does this warming of our planet mean? Well, one very interesting thing, among all of the interesting things, is that the coldest part of our planet is actually getting warmer faster than all of the other parts. So the Arctic is actually warming much faster than the rest of the planet. When you look at that yellow line that shows you how quickly Arctic temperatures are increasing, you'll see that Arctic temperatures are outpacing global average temperatures and temperatures in the northern and the southern hemisphere. What does that mean? Well, it means that polar ice caps will melt and sea levels will rise because you have icebergs, you have ice that is melting. As that ice melts, again, you don't have to be a physics major. You don't have to know anything about Archimedes or anybody like that. You know as ice melts, the level of the water will increase. Greenland's ice melting that took place this summer was what we thought would be a worst-case scenario 50 years from now. What we projected to be the worst-case scenario for Greenland's ice melt in the year 2070 happened this year in 2019. So we are 51 years ahead of schedule for how quickly that ice cap is melting in Greenland. So this means that sea levels are rising faster than anticipated. And it's been projected that by the end of this century, that sea levels will rise between 1 and 2 meters. So we're talking basically between 3 and 6 feet above current levels. Now, for a country like St. Lucia that has mountainous regions and most of the other islands, that's not that big a deal. You know, okay, we lose a little bit of coastal land, significant amount of coastal land, but the country won't disappear. But for countries in the Pacific, like Kiribati, the Marshall Islands, for countries in the Ames region, what we refer to as Africa, Indian Ocean, Mediterranean, and South China Sea, like the Maldives, as you heard, there are parts of the Maldives that are disappearing because the highest point on those islands is less than 2 meters tall. Barbados, the Bahamas, Guyana, that's below sea level. If you're talking about anywhere between a 3 and a 6 foot increase in sea level, that will have profound economic and social consequences for those countries, as it will for my country, St. Lucia. But for countries that are very low-lying and countries that are flat, populations will be displaced much more. So for all of our Caribbean countries, this will have devastating consequences. And UNDP and the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center did a model of what a 1 meter sea level rise would mean for the Caribbean. They found that approximately 1,300 square kilometers of land area would be lost. So that's equivalent, that's a landmass that's equivalent to the mass of Barbados plus Antigua and Barbuda, plus St. Vincent and the Grenadines, plus Anguilla disappearing. Now, I'm not saying these countries will disappear, but I'm saying the land loss across the Caribbean will be equivalent to the land masses of these countries no longer existing. Over 110,000 people displaced. So that's really the population of Grenada or the population of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. 149 tourism resorts damaged. Why? Because we believe that the tourists coming to the Caribbean must have that experience of walking out of their room and curling their toes in the sand with the first steps that they make. Well, there is a consequence of that, because if we continue, and our leaders continue to do this, continue to give incentives to hotels and investors to build hotels on the beach, not learning from the experience of some other countries. If you've ever been to Rio de Janeiro, for example, you'll find that Ipanema Beach and Copacabana Beach, there's not one hotel on that beach. It is the most beautiful expanse of sand that you'll ever get, but it is protected. There's a road, and all of the hotels are recessed at the back, and everybody can use the beach. So if there is a 1 meter sea level rise, hotels, high-density infrastructure will not be damaged. Unfortunately, in the Caribbean, we believe that the tourist experience must be to walk out of your room onto the sand. Well, very soon we'll have some overwater suites in the Caribbean. Loss or damage of 5 power plants. 1% of agricultural land being lost. Loss or damage of 21 CARICOM airports, because many of our airports are actually located pretty close to the shore. Land surrounding 35 ports inundated. Well, that's a no-brainer. Seaport has to be near the shore, right? So, and a loss of 567 kilometers of roads. A 2 meter sea level rise is worse, of course. Over 3,000 square kilometers of land being lost, so that's equivalent to Martinique plus Guadeloupe plus Grenada disappearing. Over 260,000 people displaced, so that's basically the population of Barbados. Over 233 tourism resorts damaged, loss or damage of 9 power plants, over 3% of agricultural land being lost, 40% of sea turtle nesting sites. Now, I'm sure very many of you are saying, yeah, but that's by the year 2100. Even the youngest student in here will probably not still be alive by then. Well, guess what? Most of our cemeteries are located near the coast because the sand there is easier to manipulate. So you know SIP now, when somebody dies, SIP means sleep in peace. SIP will mean either sink in peace or swim in peace, because that's where your bones will be. Your bones will no longer be, and you're already seeing it. This is actually a grave. The first one is actually a grave at the Shock Cemetery in St. Lucia, and you could see the erosion that's already taking place. A 1 meter sea level rise will take out most of those cemeteries, most of those grave sites. So those of you who think, you know, not in my backyard, not in my lifetime, well, more frequent flooding. The whole water cycle will be changed because you now have the temperatures are increasing, so the water cycle changes. And that has profound consequences. And you just have to look at what's going on in Venice right now. And it's actually very ironic because on Tuesday, the council in Venice deliberated and rejected measures to combat climate change. And for the very first time in the history of the building in which it was located, that building was flooded. And the mayor has made a very strong statement blaming it on climate change. Now, while you can't say for sure that climate change was responsible for the flooding in Venice, climate change has certainly worsened the flooding in Venice. And that is Venice, that already is a city that is known for being a city on water. If you look at cities like St. Petersburg in Russia, same thing, beautiful, but again, sea level rise will have serious implications for them and every single island in the Caribbean. But you'll also have longer droughts, more pronounced droughts, and it's been projected that with a 2 degrees Celsius increase in global temperature, there'll be anywhere between a 10% and 25% reduction in rainfall in our Caribbean area. Now, for countries like ours, almost every single country in the Caribbean goes through a period of water scarcity between the months of March and June. The post-carnival, those of us who still have Lenten carnivals. So now you think of that period being worsened by a 15 or 25% reduction in water availability. And even now, you know, we have rainy seasons that are really not rainy seasons anymore. The rainfall is very variable. So not like back, and it kind of feels strange for me to say back in my time, but when I was your age, we had proper rainy seasons. We don't have proper rainy seasons anymore. So you'll have greater water insecurity. Because the temperatures are increasing, the ocean temperatures are also increasing. But there's another thing that is happening, and not very many people realize that. When we speak about carbon dioxide and things that absorb carbon dioxide, what do we think of mostly? Trees, right? We say that if we plant more trees, the trees will absorb carbon dioxide because trees are a sink for carbon dioxide? Well, there's another very big sink for carbon dioxide, a body that absorbs a lot of carbon dioxide, and that's our oceans. Our oceans are a big sink for carbon dioxide. And what happens? Anybody did chemistry in this room? No? Okay. Very short, basic chemistry lesson. Carbon dioxide mixes with water, and it forms something called carbonic acid. So as the oceans absorb more carbon dioxide, carbonic acid is formed, so you have the acidity of your oceans. The oceans will now become more and more acidic. Now, if you're like me and you don't eat meat, that's a serious problem because I don't eat meat. I only eat fish and seafood. When your oceans become more acidic, it means that all of your shellfish will now have problems because they cannot form shells in acidic conditions. So things like lobster, which I don't eat often because I can't afford to eat lobster too often, conch, and all of the shellfish, that they now have a problem forming shells. But also your corals, which are living organisms, they cannot survive in warmer and more acidic temperatures. So a Caribbean dive that should look like this, and this is why people want to come to the Caribbean and dive, because they want to see Nemo and they want to see what these beautiful Caribbean reefs look like. Well, you won't see Nemo in a reef looking like this, and that's what our reefs will increasingly look like, because the reefs are dying. And if you look at what's happening in Australia with the Great Barrier Reef, but if you speak to people who dive in the Caribbean, you speak to some of the fisheries officers, for example, in St. Lucia, in the Department of Fisheries, they will tell you of some of the calamitous deaths they've seen of coral in a very short space of time, in the space of 10, 15 years. This is already happening. Food insecurity will become a bigger problem because you have warmer temperatures, you have more variable rainfall, so you have longer droughts. You also have sea level rise, so as the seawater encroaches further and further inland, your soils become more saline, so they're not as productive as they were before. You have more heat waves, which is obvious. But with more heat waves will come more health problems. And the WHO has predicted that between 2030 and 2050, an additional 250,000 people will die as a result of these warmer temperatures. That's not too far from now, 2030 is 11 years from now. 2050 that's still in our lifetime, hopefully. And that's what we're looking at. The Scientific American put out this article this month. And it is projected that if the temperatures continue increasing at this rate, by the end of this century, 1 million people will die per year in India. 1 million, let that sink in. 1 million people will die per year in India if temperatures continue to increase at this level. Forests and bushfires will increase because you have warmer temperatures, you have drier temperatures, very conducive for forests and bushfires. And you just have to look at what is happening in one of the biggest climate denial administrations in the world right now, Australia, to see what's happening in Queensland and New South Wales with the forest fires that are going out of control. That will become our new normal. That's why when we speak about business unusual, that is the new normal that we have to deal with. That is not something that any of us is used to. And of course, if you have forest fires, you have more particulate matter in your atmosphere, so people who are asthmatic will now have problems. So respiratory diseases will increase. The Lancet and the University College London have actually identified climate change as the biggest global threat, global public health threat of the 21st century. And climate change is having widespread impacts, including with vector-borne diseases. And you're seeing now diseases that we never saw before. Things like Zika and chikungunya are now rearing their heads in this region that we never saw before. Malaria will now become something that we have to grapple with because the vector that carries all of these diseases, in the case of malaria, the protozoan, something called Plasmodium falciparum, that protozoan, there are two things that happen with the malaria, that little organism that lives inside the mosquito. It develops faster as temperatures increase. So you have a protozoan on steroids as the temperature increases. But the other thing that happens is that mosquitoes are more active during the hotter months than they are during the cooler months. You just need to do your own experiment. How often do you get bitten by a mosquito in the months of December, January, February, compared to how often you get bitten by mosquitoes in the months of July, August? Mosquitoes, the biting activity during the hotter months is increased. So you have a mosquito on steroids carrying a protozoan on steroids. I don't have to tell you what the impact of that will be. Many of these vector-borne diseases will become a bigger problem. More stress-related problems. You just had to live. I worked in Dominica for 6 months after the passage of Hurricane Maria. And the impact that Maria had on people in Dominica is incalculable. And for me, it was even worse because I saw whilst I was working in Dominica, two systems were approaching, and how the thought of those pending systems traumatized the people in Dominica. The fact that, boy, this might be Maria all over again, having been just victimized by Tropical Storm Erica 2 years earlier. So the stress problems, I don't think we really appreciate just how traumatic these impacts are on the lives of people. People who lost their loved ones, people who lost all of their belongings, who lost their favorite pet. All of these things are things that you have to deal with after a major event. So there'll be profound impacts on mental health and well-being. And the Caribbean is already among the most vulnerable of small states. And all of the vulnerability indices that you look at will show you that the Caribbean ranks among the most vulnerable of small states. This is actually a picture that I'm sure we're all familiar with. This is the year 2017 when we had all these weather systems passing through the region. But I went on the website of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the National Weather Center. They allow you to go in and create these graphics of all of the hurricanes that have passed over or passed through the Atlantic and the Pacific over a particular period. So I did a graphic that looked at all of the hurricanes, the major storms that passed through the Atlantic and passed through the Pacific over the last 150 years. This is what it looked like. The computer couldn't process the Caribbean. So all you have is a massive red for the Caribbean. And that shows you just how vulnerable we are to these extreme weather events. This is Dominica after the passage of Maria. This is Rosso. This is the BVI after the passage of Irma. This is Puerto Rico. This is Barbuda. This is St. Martin. This is the Bahamas. Can you imagine waking up the next day and that's what you have to deal with? Well, almost every single one of our countries has to dread that as a possibility because maybe, with the sole exception of Trinidad and Tobago, and there have been storms that have tracked south, but almost every single, and let's just think about it, Grenada is very far south, and Grenada was hit very hard by Ivan. So it's not out of the realm of possibility that Trinidad can be hit by a storm that tracks south. Every single one of our islands runs the risk of the residents waking up the next day to that sort of mayhem. And all of the graphics show you that the number of storms are increasing. So this looks like the number of disasters by major category per year, and it shows you that the majority of them have been climate-related events. The amount of disasters per year, again, climate-related. Storms account for almost half of the economic losses from disasters. But the other thing about storms that is very, very sinister is that they victimize lower income and poor people more than they do upper income people. So although people in the middle and upper income bracket, although more of them may be affected, but when you look at the percentage of the vulnerable population, it is more devastating. And you'll understand why, because of the conditions in which they live, the ability to evacuate them, the resilience of the structures in which they live, the places in which they live, and also when it comes to fatalities, you have a higher percentage of fatalities among lower income and low middle income than you have in the upper income. But there's another thing that hurricanes do, and I think those of you who study political science will be quite interested in this graphic. With the exception of Antigua and Barbuda and St. Kitts and Nevis, hurricanes are very bad news for incumbent governments. Almost every instance where there has been a major event and there's been an election after, the government has lost. Now, I'm not saying to you that is the sole reason the government has lost. There are other circumstances, clearly. So, for example, having been involved in the campaign of the St. Lucia Labour Party in 2011, I can tell you that Hurricane Thomas in 2010 was not the only reason the United Workers' Party lost the election in 2010. But hurricanes do something to the psyche of people. Hurricanes, and also depending on how swift is the government response and how far-reaching, how effective, how partisan is the government response, that also colors, pardon the pun, people's reaction to how well the government has been able to respond to it. So hurricanes are bad news for incumbent governments. It's only St. Kitts and Nevis and Antigua. In fact, Denzel Douglas did a very good job. Denzel Douglas weathered two storms, literally and figuratively, in 1995 and 1998, and won the election in 2000. It will be very interesting to see whether Prime Minister Roosevelt Skerritt is able to do the same thing, because he had Tropical Storm Erica in 2015 that caused loss and damage amounting to 96% of his country's GDP. Then 2 years later, he had Hurricane Maria that caused loss and damage amounting to 226% of his country's GDP. He is facing the polls on the 6th of December. So he has had 2 hurricanes to deal with. So it'll be interesting to see whether Prime Minister Skerrit is an outlier and he survives this. But just every single one, the BVI, the government and the BVI was very badly beaten after the passage of Hurricane Irma. Puerto Rico, we can only hope that the elections in 2020 on the 3rd of November caused the government to fall. And that is as political as I will get on this podium. Caribbean countries will have rebuild or relocation costs of their seaports and airports of between 1% and 6% of GDP by 2050. Total rebuild costs of tourism resorts between 10 and 23 billion. And really, the salient point here is that the Caribbean will be greatly impacted if we don't do anything. And Bueno did a study in 2008 that looked at the cost of global inaction on climate change on various countries in the region, and the figures are quite startling. I think if this study was revisited now, 10 years later, given what we've seen with Hurricane Maria and Hurricane Irma, because when Bueno did this study in 2008, he could not have anticipated the rapid intensification of hurricanes that is taking place now. So you had like Hurricane Maria and Hurricane Irma, that went from a Category 1 to a Category 5 in the course of 24 hours. That's unprecedented. Or you had Hurricane Dorian this year that stayed over the Bahamas for 2 days. Again, that is one of the things that has been projected will happen as a result of climate change, that these hurricanes will just sit there and they will not move. So, is this fake news or is this science? Well, just recently, over 11,000 scientists from 153 countries wrote stating that they see climate change as the biggest issue confronting the planet right now. And if we do not take action, that the world will face catastrophic consequences. Now, I don't know how familiar you are with scientists. There are 1 or 2 scientists in the room, like Adrian. I can tell you to get 11,000 scientists to agree on one thing is extremely difficult. To get 11,000 scientists from 153 countries to agree on one thing is extremely difficult. But it shows you how overwhelming the science is where climate change is concerned. And there's also been evidence of a very strong vested interest-led lobby to negate the science, the same way that it was done with the tobacco industry, to fight back against the science, to make it look as if the science does not exist. So you've always heard, might something else be responsible? Maybe it's more volcanic activity, or maybe the Earth is moving closer to the sun, or the axis of the planet has tilted a bit, so it's getting hotter, or maybe it's land use, or maybe it's the ozone layer, or maybe it's aerosols. Well, they've deconstructed this, and they've looked at all of these factors individually, which you can see from the curve. And the only one that absolutely approximates the increase in temperature that we've been seeing is greenhouse gases, is the increase in greenhouse gases. In fact, when you combine greenhouse gases with all of these other factors, many of these factors have had a dampening effect. Like, for example, aerosols and the ozone layer have had a dampening effect. They allow you to almost accurately predict what has happened with global warming. So global warming is a man-made, as we say, an anthropogenic issue. It is something that man has caused, and it's something that man has caused through his overuse of fossil fuels and also livestock. So the threat to SIDS is existential. So that's all the doom and gloom. What can we do? What should we do? Well, we have to drastically change the way in which we operate. The theme of this is that it cannot be business as usual. It has to be business unusual. CIDIMA did a very good paper on Caribbean pathways to resilience, where they looked at 5 pathways to resilience. And I think that really paints the picture of where we should be focusing. First, on social protection for the marginal and most vulnerable, because as I said, the marginal and most vulnerable are the ones most impacted by climate change. Enhancing economic opportunities. Responding to many of these things will require money, will require the government to find resources to develop resilience. So we have to enhance economic opportunities, but also to prevent people from degrading the environment, because very often when people are poor, they have no choice but to go and do some of the things that cause environmental problems in the first place. So stimulating economic development is extremely important. Safeguarding infrastructure, environmental protection, and operational readiness and recovery, because we will be hit by a storm, we will be hit by a hurricane, we will have droughts. We need to be able to not just bounce back, but as we coined the phrase, well, I don't really think we coined it, but we've been using in Dominica quite a bit. You have to be able to bounce forward because you don't want to just bounce back to where you were before. You really want to be able to bounce forward. That's what resilience is all about. We have to develop resilience at the household, community, and national levels. Now, a very good friend of mine said, climate change is everything, but not everything is climate change. Everything is not climate change, which very succinctly means that while climate change impacts on everything, not everything that happens around us is as a result of climate change. We are worsening our situation. So when we don't have proper land use plans in place and we allow people to build anywhere, to construct in floodplains, to construct near the seashore, as this picture, I'm sure those of you who live in this country will know where this is. If you have this kind of development, this kind of high density, high value infrastructure along your coast, and you're saying that there will be a 1 to 6 foot increase in sea level, what do you think is going to happen to that infrastructure? That's not smart planning. That's not smart land use. That's a man-made disaster. That is a disaster waiting to happen. But that is not just peculiar to Barbados. This is Barbados, of course, as I'm sure all of you know. Every single one of our Caribbean countries, that picture can represent them. And that's what we do. That's what we continue to do. Our water sector must be made more resilient. The water sector will be very seriously impacted by climate change. We are already in water deficit situations in all of our countries. We have to make our water sector more resilient. But what do we see happening? We see, including in my own country, St. Lucia, we see plans for more golf courses. A golf course is the thirstiest thing you could ever put in any place. Golf courses need a lot of water. You need to keep that grass nice and lush and green. Grass before people, golf courses before people. You have to deal with your problems first. So again, we have to be careful about some of the development that we think of when this is what happens when you don't think of people and the environment first. There must be a balance, and unfortunately, we're not seeing that. We must protect our land-based ecosystems. What we don't realize is that what we do in the hinterland, as much as a hinterland there is in the Caribbean, there really is in the hinterland, what we do in the interior impacts what happens on the marine space. So when you cut down trees, and this is St. Lucia, and there's a little bit of rainfall, you'll have heavy siltation in your nearshore areas, which will cause serious problems for your marine life. When you decide that that mangrove really is an eyesore and you need to take it out to put in a marina or some other development, and you don't appreciate the fact that your mangroves are some of your best natural defenses. They prevent silt from getting into the ocean. They provide a breeding ground for many of your fishes. They provide storm surge from coming inland. But you decide that that mangrove really is an eyesore and it needs to be taken out so you could put some state-of-the-art marina. You're shooting yourself in the foot. We have to promote climate-smart agriculture. We must make more targeted use because food security will be a big issue for us. And if we think that just bringing in 40-foot containers from Miami is going to solve the problem, the minute a hurricane hits, those 40-foot containers can't come in. Your ports are inoperable. The shipping lines are impacted. What's going to happen? We saw this in Dominica. And what saved Dominica was food and root crop sector, because you had a lot of food and root crops, a lot of dasheen, a lot of yam, a lot of sweet potato. And that's what provided Dominica with the food security in the immediate aftermath of Hurricane Maria, when a lot of the shipping lines were not coming in and the supermarkets themselves had been devastated. Build resilience into the health and education sectors. I can give an entire lecture on resilience in the health sector because that is so important. Not just building in resilience into your health sector, but a simple thing like a hurricane hits and there's no electricity in your hospital. What happens to the people who are on dialysis and who must have dialysis? If they do not have dialysis, they will die, because once you go on dialysis, you can't go off dialysis unless you have a kidney transplant. So what happens to these people who are on dialysis and there's no electricity? What happens to them? What happens to people like my mother who is diabetic and who has to take insulin? And that insulin must be kept refrigerated, otherwise it loses its potency. But there's been an interruption in the electricity supply. Your power lines are down, so there is no electricity. So that insulin cannot be kept refrigerated. What happens to them? So building resilience in your health sector is not just making your health sector resilient so that it can deal with the increase in vector-borne diseases and all of these things. It's also thinking forward to when there is a major impact, and how do you keep people alive? How do you ensure that people continue to get the chronic care that they need? And this just came out in the Lancet, actually, which shows that the climate crisis will have profound effects on the health of every child alive today. And the reason I put this up is because the very last the very first sentence says, a business as usual trajectory will result in a fundamentally altered world. And again, it tells you why business unusual is where we should be going. More resilient housing and human settlements. I don't know that I need to say much more about that. Renewable energy. If we're looking at making our economies more competitive, we need to make it easier for us to manufacture, for us to produce goods. With the sole exception of Trinidad and Tobago, where electricity is produced at 7 US cents per kilowatt hour, in every other country in our region, production of electricity costs 40 US cents per kilowatt hour. You can't compete with anybody with those kind of electricity costs. But why should you when you have an abundance of wind and sun that can bring your cost of electricity down? So these are simple things that we can do. In addition, they allow us to reduce on our carbon footprint. So again, it's a win-win situation. We have to invest in more resilient public infrastructure. What used to be a 1 in 50 year or a 1 in 75 year flood event is now becoming a 1 in 5 year, 1 in 10 year event. So we now have to prepare for much stronger and heavier rainfall and more flooding. Deal with our solid waste problem. This is a bridge that went down in St. Lucia after Hurricane Thomas. That bridge didn't go down because of the water. That bridge went down because people treat our rivers like dumping grounds. So they figure if you throw something in the river, the water will eventually wash it out to sea. Well, sometimes the water does wash it out to sea, but sometimes the water deposits it in places that are not really where you want it to. And what happened there was this formed an impenetrable barrier, and eventually the bridge went down. So we have to deal with our solid waste problem. Deal with our plastic problem. This is not an unusual sight in some of our jurisdictions. Install early warning systems, because you will find yourself in a situation where you have to evacuate people, you have a storm coming. And early warning systems have actually been shown to be what gives you the highest benefit to cost ratio. The benefit to cost ratio of installing early warning systems is 9-to-1. So that, of all of the interventions that you can make, installing early warning, and that does not even, I do not believe, value the human lives and the livestock and everything else that is saved. It would be much more than 9-to-1. Retrofit emergency shelters. If you're going to put people in an emergency shelter, that emergency shelter must be secure. The other reason for doing that is in most of our countries, we use schools as emergency shelters. The problem with that is that very often the schools are the last to be reopened because there's still people in the schools. Their house has not been repaired. So our children are displaced. Our children are victimized twice. They're victimized once by the storm that passed, and secondly by the fact that they cannot go back to school because the school is being used as an emergency shelter. So we have to understand that this is our new reality, and we must have proper emergency shelters. More sustainable and responsible tourism development is extremely important. Problem is all of our countries have very high debt to GDP ratios that limit the fiscal space within which they can operate. So it means we have to very aggressively pursue climate finance. There is climate finance, there is money available out there. The Green Climate Fund and others have pledged funds to make available to countries like ours. However, what they want us to do is to present a strong case to access that money. There must be a strong evidence base. You can't go and say that, boy, we have a water problem in Guave, or we have a water problem in Speightstown, or we have a water problem in Canaries, so we need money to fix that. What the Green Climate Fund will say to you is, how did climate change contribute to that problem? So if you cannot produce empirical evidence that showed that 25, 30 years ago, your stream flows were X amount in your river, your ability to extract water from your aquifers was X amount, as in the case of Barbados or Antigua, your precipitation levels were X amount, and as a result of what has happened in the last 10 to 15 years with climate change, stream flows have decreased by this amount, precipitation has decreased by this amount. They will not get the money. But our governments continue to make noise, and it pains me every time I hear a prime minister making noise, saying, we're not getting money, and they're making it difficult for us to get the money. And I'm saying to myself, yeah, but you also have to do something at home to make sure that you present a strong case to access that money. So put in place the units that will allow you to present the strong case and collect the data, so that, because there are countries that are accessing funds. The Caribbean is the region that has accessed the least funds from the Green Climate Fund. If others are doing it, if the Maldives are doing it, what are they doing that we're not doing? They are building the evidence case. We are not doing it. We need to focus on climate change studies at the University of the West Indies. With everything I've said there to you, it should be very, very obvious that the University of the West Indies needs a school of climate studies. I make no apologies for saying that, but you cannot tell me that this is the biggest challenge facing our region. Yes, I know on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, youth unemployment, healthcare, citizen security, all of these things matter, and in the minds of some of our leaders, they matter more. My thing is they do not matter more. They matter just as much as climate change, because climate change will exacerbate every single one of these problems. Climate change, the impacts of climate change will make healthcare worse, will make citizen security worse, will make unemployment worse. There needs to be, and I'm hoping that we have a school of continuing study, a school of climate studies and resilience at the University of the West Indies. There are other universities that are doing this. Glasgow, others are offering programs in climate studies. I don't want us to offer a program. I want us to have a school dedicated to this. Public education sensitization. In September, over 7.6 million people marched for climate change. Not one country in the Caribbean joined those marches. So there's something wrong there. Because if we had ground, I think Jamaica joined afterwards, but if we had ground zero in the battle of climate change, why are we not seeing the Caribbean front and center? Italy just announced, the Minister of Education just announced that climate studies will be taught in every school in the Italian education system. But why not the Caribbean? Bravo for Italy, but why not the Caribbean? Why are we not making climate studies compulsory in the education system in our region? If it is as important, climate change is much, okay, yeah, Venice is underwater right now, so I can understand why Italy will do it. But we have to do this in the Caribbean because we have a serious problem, and this problem is going to get worse. Greta Thunberg is the rock star. And she's doing a phenomenal job. This 16-year-old young lady from Sweden, audacious, informative, informed, eloquent. But before Greta, you had the Caribbean Youth Environment Network, who were doing this. The problem with the Caribbean Youth Environment Network is that maybe the way we don't give them the support that they need, and maybe themselves, they're not audacious enough. I want to see our young people being the next Greta Thunbergs, because climate change will impact them more than it is impacting Greta Thunberg. I'm very happy for what Greta is doing, but I want to see Jamila Seeley from Barbados doing this, because Jamila has been doing an excellent job. I want to see people like Rihanna Gonzalez of Trinidad and Tobago, Snalia Mahal from St. Lucia. These were people who were involved in this fight long before Greta, but they have disappeared. We want to see our young people much more engaged. We also have to make greater use of our elders, because our elders have very important information. They've experienced this over a period of time. It's what we call citizen science, traditional and local knowledge. In Dominica, I remember Lennox Honeychurch, Dr. Lennox Honeychurch did a lecture whilst I was there, and he showed that many of the houses that were built using traditional methods have withstood Hurricane Allen, they withstood Tropical Storm Erica, and they withstood Hurricane Maria. The new, modern, quick construction methods are not working. We need to go back to our elders. I remember I'm telling a tale out of school as a cabinet secretary. A minister, an MP came to cabinet one day and he was complaining of flooding in an area in St. Lucia. And the area he was complaining of flooding, it's called Rivière Mita. For those of you who understand Creole, Rivière Mita translates into the middle of the river. So one of the MPs said very facetiously, but what do you expect to happen if people build in a community called Rivière Mita? That means at one point there was a river passing there, right? But we do that. We believe that we can retrain nature. And by retraining nature, nature will behave. But nature takes the path of least resistance. So when that water is coming down, the path of least resistance might be exactly where you've built your houses. And so we have to listen to our elders. Those of you who don't have insurance, take out insurance. You'll need it. It's that simple. I don't really need to say too much more about that. We must stay engaged in all negotiating theaters. Right now, there's a big discussion about the contribution of the airline industry and the shipping industry to greenhouse gases. What I do not want to see happen is for us to be victimized twice. Because you see some of the airlines now putting in emission trading schemes. If you book a ticket on British Airways, they'll ask you whether you want to offset the carbon that you'll use. But I don't do it because I don't know what British Airways is doing with that money. British Airways is not telling me that it's using the money it's collecting to put into climate change adaptation in the Caribbean or in the Pacific. For all I know, British Airways might be using that money to do changes to its fleet or to do other things. So we have to be careful, because what will happen is that the cost of travel will go up, and the Caribbean, that is a very important tourism destination, will find itself being victimized twice. One, by the climate change and its impacts, and secondly, by the measures that are put in place by these developed countries to appease their conscience that they're doing something about climate change. So we have to be engaged in all negotiating theater. So our trade people need to be working very closely with our climate change people and people who represent us at ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, and IMO, International Maritime Organization. They have to be engaged. We have to work together. We have to intensify the pressure on developed countries to curb their emissions of greenhouse gases. Right now, you've heard us speak of 1.5 to stay alive. With the pledges that have been made in the Paris Agreement, we will have a warming of 2.9 degrees Celsius. That's where we will find ourselves at the end of this century. That's what they pledge. If you look at not what they say they will do, but what they are doing, we'll have a warming of 3.2 degrees Celsius. So we're on track for a 3 degrees Celsius warmer world right now. And the consequences of that will be catastrophic because 1.5 degrees Celsius is not this magic threshold that once we stay below it, we find. We are at 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and we're already seeing these impacts. So much less if we get to 1.5. Anything above 1.5 will spell doom for us. And these are some of the countries that are contributing, as we saw earlier. And I did this graph to show you the share of world carbon dioxide emissions by region. And I'm sure the question that all of you are dying to ask me is, how much is my country contributing to global greenhouse gases? Well, here's the figure. Antigua and Barbuda, 0.002%. Barbados, and that's percentage, so that's not 0.002. That's 0.002 of a percent. Barbados is 0.008. The biggest emitter is Trinidad and Tobago, which is at 1/10 of a percent, 0.115. So the Caribbean as a whole contributes 0.166%, yet we are the ones suffering from this. Something wrong there. And these are the culprits. The culprits that have us on track for 4 degrees Celsius world are the Russian Federation, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, United States of America, of course. But we have our own dilemmas to deal with. Because, and I know there are Grenadians in the audience, but recently Prime Minister Mitchell announced that the oil has been found in Grenada, which is of significant economic value. And very elated he was about this. And then Ghana has said the same thing, that oil has been found in Ghana. In fact, the World Bank has projected that the oil reserves of Ghana, once Ghana starts to utilize it, will cause the economy of Ghana to grow. The GDP growth rate will go from 4% to 34%. So, but we've been saying to the countries that have oil to leave those fossil fuels in the ground and to move to carbon neutrality. However, we, as Caribbean countries who've just discovered oil, are projecting to use this oil to propel our economies forward. I'm not going to tell the governments of Grenada and Ghana what to do. I'm just going to use the words of Albert Einstein, that we can't solve problems by using the same thinking that we used when we created the problems. So we have to be very careful. One of the things that we've been able to do is maintain a moral high ground when we speak to the international world. And I remember the Minister of the Environment from India said this to me during negotiations in the Paris Agreement. He said to me, you know, I'm sympathetic with the Caribbean when it speaks about 1.5 degrees Celsius, but I have millions of people to take out of poverty in India. The only way I can do that is by taking the path of least resistance and the path of least cost, which is to use fossil fuels. So you want to tell me to forego the graduation of my people from poverty by moving into carbon neutrality, which will cost me more money and take more time. I said, yeah, okay, I understand it's an economic issue for you, but it's a life and death issue for me. It kind of dilutes that argument when we say to others, don't do it, but we do it. Paris Agreement taught us very many things. It taught us that we are successful when we engage at the highest political levels. The Caribbean was united and it was very well prepared. We cultivated allies. Civil society was mobilized and firmly on our side. Our artists supported our work. We had people like Aaron Silk from Jamaica, Adrian Martinez from Belize, Alison Hines, David Rudder, all joining the cause. Kendall Hippolyte from St. Lucia. We use the international media to tell our story. Every international media house was seeking me out, BBC, Associated Press. And once you show that you're willing to engage them and you're willing to tell them a story, they will talk to you. And we use that really to put the pressure on the developed world so that the international world would know what is going on. President Obama showed very, very strong leadership. He was engaged. He was part of this process. We met with him. He said that he was committed to an ambitious Paris Agreement, unlike the person who currently occupies the White House, who has stated that he's going to take the United States out of the Paris Agreement. There's one silver lining, though. It takes a year to pull out of the Paris Agreement. The effective date will be the day after the presidential elections next year. So there'll still be a possibility, if we can do something about the current occupier of the White House, that maybe the United States can correct this egregious wrong that it is committing. There was decisive and focused leadership from the French. This is Laurent Fabius, who was the president of the COP and also the foreign minister of France. He gave me the assurance when we met. At that meeting, he said, I will not let my Caribbean brothers go back home without 1.5 degrees Celsius. This is something he said to me. I could not have said to anyone at the time, but I knew the French were committed, and they had engaged in this round of climate diplomacy where they were very keen on ensuring that Paris was not another Copenhagen, that we didn't come out of Paris with a weak agreement. Ban Ki-moon was very sympathetic to the issues of SIDS, and every time we met with Ban Ki-moon, he would have a special meeting with small island developing states and say to us that he even give us updates on what the temperature of the political negotiations were like and where we could pitch our tent, and he was extremely good there. Caribbean was organized, which is not something you can often say about the Caribbean. Our negotiators were excellent as usual. We have the absolute best negotiators in climate change. Anywhere they punch above their weight all the time. But there's something I found. Building trust and respect takes time. The very first time I went to, there were 3 preparatory meetings for ministers, select ministers in Paris leading up to the Paris Agreement talks in November. The very first time I went to a meeting, I sat at my table, and this was the flag of St. Lucia that was put at the table. I looked and I said, St. Lucie, okay, that's me, but this is not my flag. It's the flag of Turkey. So I refused to sit at the table. I kind of walked around, and I think somebody saw this, and they hastily came, and they put this flag on. So I figured, okay, at least I don't have a flag, but it's not Turkey's flag. And then at some point, this became our flag. Not just a St. Lucia flag, but the right shade of cerulean blue, which is not something that we get right in St. Lucia all the time. What we achieved in Paris was historic. At the beginning of the Paris Agreement, Chris Money, who was a writer for the Washington Post, and he interviewed me, he said about these countries are the moral center of the climate debate. Will they be left behind? That was his article at the beginning of the Paris Agreement talks. Midway through the talks, after the first week, he spoke about a radical idea that's gaining momentum in the Paris climate talks. That's a 1.5 degrees. At the end, how a 1.5 degree target overcame the odds at COP21. But for us to do that, we had to negotiate really, really hard. One of the stories was the Minister of the Environment from Australia. He approached me at one of the early meetings, and he said, you know, I need St. Lucia to support us on an issue that you've been blocking us on, and that's land use and how we do our accounting for carbon dioxide. So, and he said, St. Lucia is the only country opposing me on this. So I went back to my technical people and I said, I just met with Greg Hunt, the Minister of the Environment from Australia, and he said that St. Lucia is the only country blocking him on this. Is this the case? And he said, no, Minister, South Africa is also blocking him on this. I said, okay. So we go to Paris and we meet, and then first thing, as soon as I get to Paris, I get a note. Greg Hunt wants to see me. So I go across with my technical people, and he runs the same story by me. And I said, okay, well, Greg, St. Lucia can consider backing off on your creative accounting on land use if you agree to support us on 1.5 degrees Celsius. He said, yeah, sure, no problem. But I knew that St. Lucia couldn't make this decision unilaterally. I had to consult with South Africa. So I got in touch with Alf, who was the lead negotiator for South Africa. I said to him, Alf, Australia has approached me, and Australia wants us to back off from the position that you and us have held on their creative accounting for land use. I've told him that we will do it I've told them that we'll consider doing it if they will support us on 1.5 degrees Celsius. Alf said to me, 1.5 degrees Celsius is extremely important for South Africa and the entire African region, so they'll support us on this. So Greg Hunt calls another meeting to talk to St. Lucia on this, but this time we go with South Africa, and his mouth drops because he was playing divide and rule. He thought that he could pitch one thing to South Africa, something else to St. Lucia, and at the end of the day walk away with nothing. That we would get nothing and he would get everything that he wanted. So we told him that 1.5 degrees. Fast forward, he says, yes, okay, Australia will support 1.5 degrees Celsius. The very first plenary after this, there's discussion on this whole long-term temperature goal. Greg Hunt says nothing. Australia delegation says nothing. Another meeting, they say nothing again. So I get a frantic WhatsApp message from my technical negotiators, and they say, Minister, we have a problem. Australia is reneging because they're not supporting us. I said, okay, let's call the Sydney Morning Herald in. So we called the Sydney Morning Herald, and we told them that St. Lucia and South Africa and Australia had struck a deal where we would support Australia on dropping their creative accounting, and they would support us on 1.5. So Sydney Morning Herald the very next day says, Australia supports Caribbean islands on 1.5 degrees Celsius. At that point, Greg Hunt had no choice. He had to He had to, and these are some of the things that you have to do during negotiations. You can't always play fair because the people you're negotiating with are not playing fair. So we're strongest when we work together. And the words of Margaret Mead, for me, come to mind. Never doubt that a small group of committed citizens can change the world, and we showed that in the Caribbean. Really, this is about our common future. This is about sustainable development and ensuring that the planet we leave behind is a planet that you can live in, and a planet that is as good as the planet that was left by our parents. We have to have a balance between people, profit, and the planet. The 3 Ps have to be balanced. In developing our countries, we cannot destroy its DNA, and I'm sorry, but that is the development I see taking place across our region right now. We are destroying the DNA of our countries in short-term pursuit of economic gain. This is not a gamble, you know. When you gamble, there's a chance that you will win, even if the house almost always wins, but there's still a remote chance we will not win this fight. We will not win this gamble if we do not make the changes that we need to make. We have to align our development agenda with the 2030 agenda. Small island developing states are the biggest victims of this tragedy of the commons, where people are just taking and taking and taking out, and nobody is looking at what is left behind, and we're the ones who are being victimized. Big changes are required. Big changes are required from all of us. We have to reduce on our use of single-use plastics. We have to plant more trees. Consume less meat. I won't tell you go vegetarian. I won't tell you stop eating meat. I know that's a big lifestyle choice, but at least consume less meat. If you cut down at least 1 or 2 meat meals a week, then it means that there's less livestock. In the words of Beanie Man, there's less cow poop, so we have less methane gas being produced. Do not buy more than you need. What is driving this is overactive consumption and production. That every new iPhone that comes out, we must have it. Every new this that comes out, we must have it. We go to the supermarket and we buy much more food than we need. We have to buy, and the advice I'm giving you is advice that will help you economically. You can't afford to be throwing money away, but that's what we're doing. Start a mini compost bin, so that some of the food that you must waste, you could put it back into the ground and you increase the organic content of your soil. Support local business. The more local business you support is the less product that has to be imported, so the smaller the carbon footprint of the products that you're buying. And what we do there is we stimulate our local economy, because if we're buying local, it means now that that money is stimulating GDP growth. Turn off your car when you're idling. Some of the new cars do that. I don't think any of us, well, probably very few of us can afford to buy these new cars that switch off when they're idling, but you could do it yourself. Just switch off your car if you're going to be idling for a long period of time. You're saving gas and you're reducing on your carbon footprint. If possible, and if your funds permit, buy an electric car. This is an easy one. Switch to LED light bulbs. Unplug devices. It's not because you've disconnected your phone. It means that you're no longer drawing power from that outlet. Unplug it, because there is still what is called phantom electricity that's going through this thing, and you are still using up electricity by having these devices plugged in. Invest in renewable energy. Barbados has been very good at that with solar water heaters, but some of our other countries have not. And if possible, put in solar PV panels. Fix those leaking faucets. We can't afford to be wasting water the way we're wasting water. And the plastic water bottles. I know it's sexy to walk around with a water bottle if you're jogging or whatever, but the capture, store, and use rainwater, but these are actually sexier. These aluminum water bottles that are refillable, so you could ditch the plastic, please. If there's one message I can leave with you, is ditch the plastic. Plastic, no good. Paraphrasing Beanie Man, plastic, not good. Reuse, reduce, and recycle as much as you can. For goodness sake, let's design our buildings so that we can make use of the lighting and the cooling breezes that we have. We design these buildings that we have to close up, and we have to keep lit during the day, and we have to air condition during the day, and we're using up energy that we do not need to use. And it also forces people like me to have to wear a jacket and a tie because the rooms are so cold. That's not necessary. And you know what's happening too? All of these buildings now have mold, because they air conditioned and they're enclosed, so we have mold problems in all of our buildings. That's not necessary. The environment that we're living in should allow us to dispense with a lot of the energy that we're using. Get engaged, get active, spread the word. We need all of you to now, you see, before environmentalists were considered to be tree huggers, people who are kind of wacky, these green people, but this is not about environmentalism and hugging trees. This is about life and death. This is about you taking steps that will save the planet, will save your lives, will save your livelihoods, and will allow you to enjoy a quality of life that is as good or better than the one that your parents enjoyed. That's not what's happening now. And for goodness sake, make climate change and sustainable development issues, make them political issues. Get your politicians to understand that if they're not going to talk to you about sustainable development and climate change, don't come and talk to you. I'm serious about this because, you see, the future that you have will depend on the steps that they take and how they advocate on your behalf and what they do. So you have to make climate change and sustainable development political issues as they are being made all around the world. When I left university, and I was like you, and I was a PhD, I came out with my PhD, I thought that my job would be to reform agriculture and reform this and reform that. And I realized, nah, not going to happen in my lifetime. My goal is much more profound and much more important, as Kama said. My goal is in preventing the world from destroying itself. Your goal will be to reform it. My goal is preventing the world from destroying itself. But for me to do that, I need your help. I can't do this on my own. Those of us who engage in this fight can't do it on our own. You have to be engaged. You have to help us. Otherwise, you will have a very bleak future ahead of you. The climate is changing. Question is, are you changing and are you willing to change? If you don't change, then these two beautiful paintings by Jonathan Gladding that we've used basically as our posters for this whole climate fight will be our reality, and I would hate that to be the reality of anybody in this room. Thank you very much.
That was the epitome of excellence, and I think it deserves another round of applause. And having done such a wonderful job, and he has given us so much of his time and his energy and his profound intellect, and we can see his passion for his area, it's almost very difficult for me to ask him to come and do some more work. But I know the night would be incomplete if he didn't get a chance to interact with you. And we can open the floor now to, we don't like to call it question and answer, but to have an open discussion. I'm sure Jimmy will be willing to facilitate. So we'll just try to do it in as orderly a manner as we can, and the floor is now open for your questions, comments, feedback, and any reaction you want or any discussion you want to have with our wonderful presenter tonight.
Good evening. My name is Kimar Stewart. I am a social science student at the university. And as of recent, we saw the Barbadian Prime Minister giving constant speeches to the United Nations on climate change. So I want to know what is the regional outlook, besides Barbados, to join the fight for CARICOM, to join the fight against climate change. And could you give us a brief synopsis of the attitudes of the other regional heads of government towards joining the fight?
Thank you. It's an excellent question. I think Mia Motley is an outlier. Her approach on climate change and development has been awesome, has been really almost model. She gets it. She articulates the issues. Unlike some of our leaders who speak, when they speak of climate change, they only speak about the absence of climate finance and we need more money and we need more money. Mia Motley understands that it's about much more than money. The other prime minister, I think, who gets it is Prime Minister Roosevelt Skerritt of Dominica, because he has been the victim of two hurricanes in the space of 2 years, Erica in 2015 and Maria in 2017. I wish I could give our other leaders as good a passing grade. Well, I'm not just giving Mia Motley a passing grade, I'm giving her a distinction, as I'm giving to Roosevelt Skerritt. I wish I could give our other prime ministers that same grade. I can't. I think the Caribbean dropped the ball after Paris. We did a very good job in Paris of mobilizing public support. Our heads were engaged, the CARICOM Secretary General was engaged, but it's almost as if after having achieved the success in the Paris Agreement, we patted ourselves on the shoulder and we said, good job, we did it, now let's go back to normal programming. And you could see it because the intensity is no longer there. You look at our participation in the subsequent conference of the parties, we haven't had the same level of high-level political representation. The Caribbean is crying out for political leadership on climate change and sustainable development. We do not have it right now, with the exception of Mia Motley and Roosevelt Skerritt. We do not have it. And I think the other leaders and the other ministers, it's not just the leaders, it's also the ministers. I'm not seeing it from our ministers. And it really is it's something that we have to take more seriously because, as I said, our future is at stake. And it's kind of difficult to convince the international community that they should take you seriously when at home they're aware that the things you're doing, you're not taking yourself seriously. So I wish I could tell you that I am very optimistic and very enthused about what is happening in the regional space right now. I cannot. I can tell you I'm very excited by the energy that Prime Minister Motley has brought and the commitment that Prime Minister Skerrit has. I know some of them would like me for saying this, but no, I think we really need to step up, and we're not there right now. I'm seeing much more energy from some of the other regions that are not at ground zero in this climate fight than I'm seeing from the Caribbean, and that bothers me.
Good night, Nicole Foster, Faculty of Law, UWI, Cave Hill. A fabulous lecture, Jimmy. What I wanted to pick up on, so sort of following on this thing, because it's kind of this lack of engagement of the Caribbean generally, notwithstanding the really strong interest that we have in this issue. And I was interested in your comments about the lack of the voice of the youth in the context of the climate change marches that were taking place. And I actually quarreled with my classes. I came into class and I said, what are y'all doing in here? You know, everybody all over the world, you know, the Friday when they were all out on the streets. I'm teaching human rights and they're all in class. And I'm like, why are you all here? Yeah, you know, this is going to affect you more than anybody else, but you're just here like business as usual. And I'm wondering, you know, it's something that I struggle with here on campus in terms of what we can do, or, you know, what's the solution to that problem of that disconnect. I mean, we're talking climate change now, but I had the same discussion with them about the CSME town hall meeting that we had with Prime Minister Motley again. And, you know, there seems to be a disengagement, a lack of realization of their power, of their need to, you know, they need to do more to make their voices heard, to force the politicians to take these things on board. So I was just wondering if you had any ideas about how we can change that culture, how we can better engage with our youth and with the university community in terms of the students, to make them more active on these issues that really, at the end of the day, affect their lives even more than they will affect ours. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. I think we take it for granted that the young people are aware of the problem. I don't think they are. I think we have failed in our mission of articulating this problem and articulating it in ways that matter to them, in ways that they understand. One of the problems with climate scientists is that we are very good at techno speak. So, you know, we rattle off things like GHG and IPCC and this, thinking that people understand what we're saying, and they don't. And I remember I always used to have to say to my technical officers in my ministry, doesn't matter if you're speaking to me, and yes, I know because I have a science background, do not use acronyms when you speak. Let people know you're speaking about greenhouse gases. Let people know that you're talking about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and what it is and what it means. So what you have right now is the negotiators working in one space and doing a fantastic job, really punching above their weight. Because one of the things you don't understand about climate change negotiations is that for the Caribbean, we go with a team, each country goes with a team probably of around 3 people. And so let's say for 12 Caribbean countries, you have maybe 35, 40 people attending. You have some technical support from maybe like a group like Climate Analytics, and you have a group in Grenada called Leon Charles and Associates who provide good technical support. But you're going up against a US delegation that comprises 100 people. And so when you're negotiating, the Warsaw negotiations, we never slept. At the COP in Warsaw, we never slept to try and get loss and damage. I remember leaving the convention hall at 4 o'clock in the morning and coming back at 7 o'clock. And my expert on loss and damage, Dawn Nathaniel, she never slept. She went 48 hours without sleeping. And so they are caught up in their own space. They don't have time for them to, unfortunately, for them to do that interaction. We now need to find a way to interact with our young people so that they can understand what these issues are. And I think that's where the university comes in. I think that's where our civil society comes in, and that's why I think it's important for us to engage civil society, so that civil society now takes this on as their fight. So it's not a government thing. Climate change can't be a public sector government fight. It has to be a country fight. But civil society is not engaged. Civil society was engaged leading up to Paris, but their only purpose was 1.5 to stay alive, and we must get an ambitious Paris Agreement. After we got it, we disengaged from them. So all of these lessons that I told you we learned going into Paris, we then abandoned all of them. So I think the onus is on us to work with young people. And as I said, those of you in this room, get engaged, find out a little bit more. This is important. This is, if you think citizen security is important and healthcare is important, for me, this is the mother and father of all issues. And it's not just because I'm invested in it. It's because I also come to this as a former politician, Tennyson. I'm not sure if I'm still a politician, but yeah, a former politician? Says the senior lecturer who is, I guess, telling you that he's still a politician. So yes, as somebody who's aware of all of the issues that a cabinet has to confront, but climate, and that's the other problem, the cabinets do not understand the gravity of this problem. The cabinets in the Caribbean do not understand how serious climate change is an issue. They don't. So you can't blame the young people too much because our leaders don't understand. So we really have a tremendous task ahead of us to get people to understand in the simplest possible terms what this means, how we're being impacted, and why we need to take action, and the things that we need to do. So when you hear somebody say they're going to do something, you challenge them and say, but hold on. But I thought that was going to worsen the situation. We get half an hour of rainfall in St. Lucia now and Castries floods. Half an hour of rainfall cannot cause or should not cause Castries to flood. And it's not climate change causing Castries to flood. It is plastics that are clogging waterways. It is poor land use. It is roofs without guttering that's concentrating stormwater in one area. It's all of these things. So we have to hold our politicians, our leaders, take them to task and tell them they need to do. But the short answer to your question, Nicole, I think that the onus is on us. We have to engage with our young people more so that, because I'm sure every single person in this room after tonight is looking at climate change differently. So if we can do that in 1 hour, think of what we can do with a sustained approach to this. And that's why I think it is critically important for the university to take this battle and run with it, so that every student has to learn what climate change is about. And the same thing that the government of Italy has done, make climate studies compulsory throughout the education system. Every single one of our countries need to do that. And the CXC needs to do it. And we need to do it even before you start looking at CXC. You need to do it at the primary school level right up. That's what has to happen.
Hi, good night. My name is Mackenzie Gooden. I'm a final year student in international relations. Towards the end of what you were saying that one of the important things is to politicize and basically securitize climate change as an issue that needs to be dealt with. Mm-hmm. But you also would have spoken about how, in terms of economics, how governments have to make difficult decisions. How do I elevate my people out of poverty? So how do you meet in the middle? How do you reconcile those things, particularly in the context of stuff like election cycles and voting and the fact that you want to get your government back in, and you have to appeal to the demands of the people who want, education, a proper place to live, at the same time having to balance these existential threats?
And the short response of that would be the slide that I put up of the impact of hurricanes on the GDP of the country and the impact of hurricanes on the longevity of administrations. And I think that's the short-sightedness of the approach of many of our politicians, not understanding that, yes, you do have a problem in ensuring that you have proper health care for your people and that the roads are paved and that the schools can open on time and they're repaired. But these things should not be either or with climate change. What you have to do is to infuse climate resilience into everything that you do. So climate resilience cannot be one thing. So there can't be a ministry of climate change, a ministry of climate resilience, as some of our governments have tried to do. Climate change and climate resilience has to be something that is cross-cutting and that is part of the culture of the country. So when you're looking at building a new hospital, when you're looking at putting down a new health center, you build resilience into it. When you're looking at putting down a new road, you build resilience into it. So if you do that for every single thing that you do, it might cost you $5 more. But if you recall the slide that I put up that showed the benefit-cost ratio of making some of these interventions, you will save your time. This stitching time saves 9. In the case of early warning systems, a stitch in time actually does save 9 because the benefit cost ratio of early warning systems is 9:1. And for many other things, that's what it is. So I think our leaders have to understand the financial implications of no action on climate change, not just no action by the international community, but no action by them. And they have to have a very honest conversation with the population. The thing that I find remarkable is how few of our leaders have learned from the misfortunes of Roosevelt Skerritt in Dominica, Gaston Brown in Antigua and Barbuda, and now in the Bahamas, and before that, Keith Mitchell in Grenada. These are things that happened recently, and we don't understand how climate change can take a country like the Bahamas, that is considered an upper middle income country, and does not qualify for concessional aid from anyone, and reduce its GDP to the point where the very next day, 24 hours later, it is no longer upper middle income. That's what climate change will do to you. Climate change will wipe out 200% of your GDP in 24 hours. So if you think that dealing with this existential issue of citizen security or healthcare is important now, think about how you recover when you wake up the next day and your country has been reduced to ruin, like Dominica was after Maria, or like Grenada was after Ivan. That is really how we must change the argument, change the discussion.
Good night. My name is Vanessa Mason. I'm also a third-year student of International Relations. And upon listening to your presentation, I looked to my colleague and I said, when you talked about the 51 years, we are ahead in terms of the environmental crisis. I looked at her and I said, I hope to God that Jesus comes soon. And that was out of fear. And when I hear terms like sustainable development, I cannot somehow reconcile with them, because for me, tourism is a high consumption industry. When you look at the fuel used in airplanes to get to our destinations, when you look at how hotels do laundry, when you look at those sort of things, what really is sustainable tourism, and can it really help us to show the international community that we are serious about climate change?
That's an awesome question. Sustainable tourism is about reusing water. So for example, instead of using, one of my responsibilities in that long portfolio that Tennyson read out was responsibility for water. I had responsibility for the water sector. And there's the one part of my portfolio that gave me the biggest headache. You know, I wish that the Prime Minister had not given me water and everything that he'd given me, because when people wake up and they have no water in their taps and they've had no water for five days or 2 weeks, they want blood. And hotels, it always bothered me that you have a water company in St. Lucia, Wasco, the Water and Sewage Company, that captures very scarce water from a water source. It uses electricity to pump that water to a treatment plant. It uses electricity and manpower and chemicals to make that water potable, so to remove all of the material that makes that water undrinkable, to filter it, etc. Then uses electricity and manpower and a lot of money to pump that water to your home, and you promptly flush that water down the toilet. Now think about that. Does that make any sense? But our hotels do that every single day, with multiple toilets flushing in every single room. Our hotels use that same water every single day to water their gardens, so that the landscape can look so beautiful and lush. We can be reusing water. There's nothing that says you must use potable water to flush your toilets. There's nothing that says you must use potable water to wash to irrigate your gardens. So that's how you make tourism more sustainable. You also deal with waste differently. And there are actually hotels in St. Lucia, one of the highest end resorts in St. Lucia. I won't mention its name because I don't want to give it free advertising. But to stay at that hotel costs something like $2,000 a night. But it's worth it. I mean, I did stay there. I didn't pay the $2,000 a night. I got a free pass for a weekend, coinciding with my anniversary, and I can tell you it's worth it. If you have to ask how much does this cost $2,000, it means you can't afford it, so don't think about it. But anyway, my whole reason for saying this to you is that they do not use any water from the water company. They harvest their own water, and they treat their own water. They don't put out any wastewater into the ocean. They treat it, they recycle it, they use it. So there are hotels that are going for this environmental certification that are moving towards a less heavily extractive use of resources, and I think we need to push them in that direction. So energy, how they use energy. How many hotels you go into, and there are rooms with nobody in them, And they all lit and air conditioned. And they're not just lit, because we believe we must have these beautiful chandeliers. And these beautiful chandeliers still have incandescent bulbs in them, They don't even have, you can now get LED bulbs that mimic incandescent bulbs. They don't even have that. So just put in things like motion sensors. So when people leave rooms, that the lights go off and the air conditioning goes off. They can do that to reduce on their carbon footprint. How they use water, how they use energy, how they treat with wastewater, I think are the three big issues that can make hotels much more sustainable than they are right now. Also, how they treat their employees, but that's a different question for a different.
Dr. Fletcher, thank you so much for a brilliant lecture.
Thank you.
I'm really sort of excited to hear you and to hear the enthusiasm and the work that you have done. I've been involved in this environmental area for many years. 1981, I attended the New and Renewable Sources of Energy conference where Oliver Headley from Barbados was actually promoting, and Barbados was one of the few sort of leaders in the solar energy fight. At that conference, it was the ordinary. Wangari Maathai brought women from the rural areas to talk about climate change. They didn't use the language, but they talked about droughts, walking further and further for firewood, etc. The Caribbean, at that time, our leaders were not united. Eric Williams didn't go because he said oil don't spoil. Edward Seaga talked about nuclear energy as the way forward. It was really quite a depressing conference from a Caribbean standpoint. Fast forward to 1992, and we had the Caribbean Conservation Association. We had several young people involved in the Caribbean in really becoming alive in preparation for the UN conference on environment and development in Rio. However, what I have seen is that every time we get excited, we have the big conference, we have great negotiators, we come back to a framework of money which is led by an economics founded on money as the center of all development. And that is taking us down the road to the fast fixes, a tourism with bigger hotels rather than the Indonesian model, the young person before. More guest houses, more use of local foods. And while the Sedima model of getting ready is useful, I still find it a reactive framework. We are taking the present framework as a given. The permaculture model of wealth tells us that there are 8 forms of wealth: the intellectual, the spiritual, the cultural, social, living wealth, which is water, air, experiential wealth that you talked about. And the need, financial being just one of the 8 forms of wealth. The need, unless we really integrate a model of wealth and development that is more balanced than the GDP, we will continue to be picking up the pieces. And I agree with you, we have to start with our school children, and the university has to play an important role in educating into the impact of climate change. But it's not a quest, how do we really transform the way we think about growth and development? How do we transform our educational system so we are not preparing children for passing exams, but preparing them for life? How do we prepare the people who go into office, political office, to actually think people first? Life and sustainability, water, air as value, social linkages as value. Because unless we do that, 20 years from now, we will be, we will be, still have great negotiators. We may, but we may have destroyed the foundation of our islands irreparably. So I'm just sharing my concern about what I think requires a more fundamental rethinking of who we are as a people, what it is we want from our children and our school system, and what it is we want from our politicians. Just one last thing on the tree huggers. The tree huggers were women in India, way back when the business people were cutting down the forest. And a lot of the rural women, recognizing that this was threatening their lives and their futures, hugged the trees. So, and Vandana Shiva really made their tree hugging a global rallying issue. Yeah. So they have been our teachers.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely. I think, and there's so many salient lessons in what you said. The first one that struck me is you're absolutely right. Prof. Headley was one of the pioneers in this whole solar drying thing. When Prof. Headley was speaking, drying, and there were others within, I remember Clem Sankat did quite a bit of work too. When they were doing this work, nobody was talking about solar energy. I became produce chemist in St. Lucia in 1991 after finishing off my PhD, and I saw the work that people like Henry Lubin and Desmond Destang had done in the produce chemist lab, and you had other people like Claudia Bellot in Dominica, Guido Marcel in Grenada, who had done tremendous work. All of that work was allowed to just languish. Nobody took it on. And now, you know what? You go into Whole Foods or to Holland and Barrett, and all of the products that they developed then are the products that are on the shelves. And you talk about creating economic wealth. We had that intellectual capacity to create that economic wealth so many years ago, but we left it alone because we felt that it was better to import stuff from the United States. So now the turmeric that our parents gave us when we fell, and not understanding the biochemistry behind it or the physiology behind it, that it was an anti-inflammatory, or the ginger tea that we were given when we had a stomach ailment, or the soursop leaves that we were given to drink, and now we're told that it is one of the strongest anti-carcinogens you can get. That intellectual capacity has been there, and we are not using that indigenous and traditional knowledge. So when you spoke about Prof. Headley, I remember, Prof. Headley, Sankat, and all of these others who did some tremendous work in this, and that is the problem. The point on GDP is so right. When you tell me that you're going to look at a country like Barbados, and I see that because Barbados' GDP per capita is X amount, it is now an upper middle income country, or the Bahamas is an upper middle income country. And you're not looking at vulnerability. You're not looking at the fact that those countries can be brought down to their knees 24 hours later by a hurricane. But you're going to deny them concessional financing because you have used this foolish construct of GDP per capita, which can be totally skewed by the presence of one or two big wealth creating engines that. So you're looking at GDP per capita, but you're not looking at your Gini coefficient. So you're not looking at equality and inequality in your country. That makes no sense. So you're right. We have to change that narrative completely. And we, unfortunately, we do not seem to understand that, which is why I put this slide up. Climate change, responding to climate change, is actually about system change. And it's not system change, just changing the system. Man, you see this Westminster system, it's working. No, the system is in here. It's changing the way we think. It's changing our attitudes. It's changing how we hold accountable the people who are supposed to be leading us in the public service, in the private sector, We have to have different standards of accountability and different standards of leadership from them. Unless we do that, you say 20 years time our negotiators won't be there, 20 years time some of our countries won't be there at the rate we're going. So we have to understand, and that's why you have to get more active and more engaged. You have to make these political issues, not just social and economic issues, but you have to make them into political issues and say that unless you are going to tell me how you will treat with these issues, don't come and talk to me. You're not going to get my vote. It's that simple.
He worked hard and he worked well tonight. So we will, without further ado, call on our MPhil student, very bright MPhil student who just submitted his MPhil thesis, Devron Bruce, to give the vote of thanks. Devron.
Protocols having been observed, it is with great pleasure that I have been chosen to deliver tonight's vote of thanks for the 14th annual Patrick Emmanuel Memorial Lecture. And I would firstly like to acknowledge Dr. Fletcher and thank him for his presentation entitled Business Unusual, the Caribbean's Response to the Existential Threat of Climate Change. And it was an enlightening discussion as you effectively highlighted the serious threat of climate change through the use of statistics and an enriched discussion. You have shown the very real consequences of this threat through the unfortunate realities of our regional neighbors, Dominica, Bahamas, the unfortunate realities. Beyond these threats, you have shown us how to be more resilient through smarter land use, renewable energy, and more sustainable tourism and development. You have made some thoughtful recommendations, such as the Center for Climate Change and, a Center for Climate Change at the University of the West Indies, and getting our young persons involved in the fight against the climate threat. You have highlighted the contradictions between our attempts, or rather the contradictions between our attempts for economic growth and how these attempts can threaten our daily lives. And more importantly, you have shown us how to grow sustainably. Ultimately, you have informed us and entertained us, and it was a night well spent. Hopefully, we will not have to swim in peace, Dr. Fletcher. Thank you. And before we leave, we would like to present you with a gift on the behalf of the department. Thank you. And finally, to the audience, I hope that it was as enjoyable for you as it was for me, and everybody just have a great night and travel safely. Thank you.